but no mask, huh? That's an odd combo.
Well, I want to make sure you can hear me.
Well, we've got a, he'll eventually show up so I can start, I think.
Desi's getting.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Good morning, everybody. And let me just make sure our everything's lined up. Okay. All right, so today we're going to go over a couple of things. We, as usual, will start with our updates from Central New Mexico. Then our deep dive topic for today is going to be focused on our budget and our city's fiscal situation, economic outlook, and so forth. We are going to have a presentation based on PowerPoint, and so we'll try and make sure that the cameras can sort of see the screen and so forth. And we're going to be sending out that PowerPoint as well. And we also need to take care of some legal actions today, so I'm going to do that before we get into budget here in just a minute. But let me begin with some updates from Central New Mexico. First, Presbyterian's testing site at Balloon Fiesta Park is going to be open on Saturday, this Saturday again. So those hours have shifted, so we just want to remind folks it is open this Saturday, and it's going to be from 9 to 3. Also, Tricor is temporarily consolidating hours at some of their patient centers effective April 20th. And so this does not impact COVID operations at all. Their concern is really just for patients and employees' safety. So if you hear about that, we just want folks to know it's not going to impact testing rates or anything like that. It's just about employee health. Also, the New Mexico Department of Veterans Services is urging veterans and unmarried surviving spouses of veterans who own homes to check with their county assessor's office for property tax deadlines. And applying for the Veterans Property Tax Exemption. Just a reminder there for folks. Now, also our New Mexico Superintendent of Insurance wants to extend some appreciation to our major insurers. And this is everyone who is always advertising on TV, but Allstate, Geico, Liberty Mutual, Progressive, etc. These companies have actually been really helpful with respect to giving policyholders money back because of the fact that they're driving less and accidents are down. And so that's helping out our superintendent of insurance. And the notice is really to just check with your insurance company to make sure you can get that benefit. And you can also probably give the superintendent of insurance a call if you have questions on that. Also, our U.S. Senator Tom Udall is having a webinar with our State Economic Development Department to share information about economic assistance. That webinar is going to be at 2:30 on Monday, April 20th. Okay, a couple of items that we need to take care of today. The first one is there was some legislation that went through council on Monday. Had a really good debate, and I followed up with most of the councilors, and I think we basically feel like, at least from our administration standpoint, there's a better way to do this. So I am going to veto that legislation. We did that just a little bit ago, and this is the piece of legislation right here. And basically, in these challenging times, I really respect council's desire to try and step up and help the city's efforts to cope with the coronavirus. I think after review of this, the intent was great in that it wanted some transparency and ability to vet a lot of the reimbursements and so forth. But the way it was put together, I think actually would have just made sure everything took a lot longer. So what we're going to do is suggest that we just go through the standard committee of the whole process, just like the budget. In that way, every counselor can chime in. It's also transparent, and it follows the same process as we have before. And because it's budget season, that also is sort of structured in our calendar as well. And so I think that's going to be a good path going forward and will alleviate some of the challenges raised by this ordinance with respect to separation of powers and also delay in reimbursement of funds. So with that, the second piece of action that I need to take is declaring, this is actually going to be our fourth emergency declaration. This one is somewhat unique in that it actually is basically nothing new. It consolidates the other three, and then it extends all of them till mid-May. So all this really is doing is, again, extending the pass-through declarations to mid-May, and that lines up with the public health projections. It lines up with everything, actually, that in many ways the state and other entities are already doing, and I think public expectations as well. So we're going to go ahead and sign that. And again, it is also meant just as a public record. It has consolidated all the various things of what department is handling what and what ordinances we're using and in what aspects we're using the public health order. And so for us, it's also just a nice clarifying document from a legal perspective. And so while I sign that, again, nothing particularly new out of that. And let's see, today is the 17th, I think, right? Okay. All right, so that declaration is now signed. And again, just to touch on what's in there, it really, so public events for the city public events and so forth. We announced this before, but are now just codifying it. Everything will be on hold till mid-May. Okay, so with that being said, let's proceed to our deep dive topic for today. And we know we've got lots of challenges, whether it's the businesses that are facing economic challenges. Want to remind folks that the city, our revenues are largely based on business revenues. They're largely based on GRT tax. So we, in many ways, are impacted the same way. Now, that's a little bit different. The county, for example, is heavily based on property tax, which, again, sort of acts differently. And the state as well has all the taxes rolled up into it, but also, of course, that big oil and gas component. So we do want to emphasize as we go through this, this economic picture and story for the city of Albuquerque's budget is really specific to our municipality, to the city of Albuquerque. And the impacts we feel from Corona are different than other levels of government, such as the county and the state. And so for us, we want to remind folks that, you know, it's no surprise that in a public health emergency, we're taking a huge hit to our budget. And so we are grateful that at least going into this, our budget was in very good shape. For the past 2 years, we've been investing in our local economy, and it was showing. All the economic indicators were actually up, and we were looking forward to a healthy budget year until this happened. Now, we've also been very fiscally prudent, and that's helped on the other side. Our team, led by our CFO, Sanjay Bhakta, who's going to speak in a moment, and a lot of folks that I brought over from the auditor's office, including Sanjay, who was our deputy state auditor. They've just done a great job throughout this administration's tenure in terms of managing the budget on both sides. That means understanding when we need revenues, what we should use them for. It also means increasing and improving our bond ratings historically and keeping us in strong fiscal position. So we came into the crisis from that standpoint, and in some ways that's very helpful. So what we're doing is we're taking proactive steps to try and prevent layoffs. We do know that other cities all around the country, and in fact some in New Mexico, are facing serious challenges with respect to furloughs and layoffs. We are doing all we can to prevent that. We want to make sure that we are keeping our city running, especially from a safety net and frontline perspective, and even from a business perspective with respect to our planning department, things like permitting and all those kinds of things that we want to try and keep going. And so the actions that we're taking are really about trying to make sure that we don't have to do layoffs or furloughs. So right now we're taking some smaller actions that hopefully will prevent those painful choices. We are limiting hiring significantly. We also have eliminated travel for the rest of the year. And we also are looking at all of our contracts and reviewing what is still relevant and what's not and what we can cut going forward. I've also directed our departments to come up with their own cost savings measures at each department level. Now, as I bring up our CFO, I want to highlight as an overview sort of the strategy here. First, we want to try and use the federal funds to replace the revenue that we're not getting. And if we can do that, that is a great thing. It means we're not going to have to make any of those tough choices. And if we can't do that, then we have some ideas about maybe the state can help in different ways, and we'll do a lot more belt tightening, and then hopefully that will work. If we don't receive assistance from those two entities, then we're going to be in a very difficult place, and we are going to have to look at things like layoffs and furloughs. But we are going to try and do everything we can to avoid that, and right now we have some plans to do just that. So To begin, we're going to talk about the economy in general and then get back to those specifics for Albuquerque. And so to do that, I want to bring up Sanjay Bhakta, our city's CFO. And let me just pause too and just make sure that we have him and the screen. We're all set there. So Sanjay, come on up.
Thank you, Mayor. So we're going to talk about the economy in general for the U.S. government and also what context we will have an impact in New Mexico. The national indicators are pretty gloomy right now. The GDP is expected to decline 3.5% in the first quarter. And in the second quarter, it would probably decline close to 27%, which is unprecedented, and it's so sudden that it has a shocking impact on the economy and all the local governments' budget, not just us. Significant economic impact is expected throughout the 2020. It's kind of driven by the timeline as to when we are open for businesses and things like that. And it certainly will have a lingering impact in 2021. We expect that it could be maybe at least in 2021 and also 2022. Unemployment right now is expected to reach at about 10% in the US, and it can actually go further higher. In New Mexico, we are kind of trending with the same level of unemployment with US government, and our unemployment rate as of last week was about 8.7%. Nearly 73,000 people applied for unemployment in New Mexico as of last week. And filing will actually grow for several weeks in near future. New Mexico has, Albuquerque has 26% of the population of New Mexico. However, when it comes to jobs, we have 46% of the jobs. So that has a compounding impact in New Mexico compared to other parts of state. So Albuquerque kind of gets hit harder when it comes to unemployment because we have 46% jobs. The economic overview in Albuquerque, there are about 21 sectors that we routinely monitor as far as the growth or decline, and these sectors are what we get the gross receipts by when we receive the tax from Tax and Revenue Department. So we have monthly data of these 21 sectors. Out of those, the top 5 sectors which got the hardest hit are hospitality and restaurants, arts, entertainment and recreation, manufacturing, retail, and some other services. The other services are very small businesses like barber shops, car repair shops, nail salons and dry cleaners and things like that. If you can see, the hospitality and restaurant got a hit of 70% decline in just March and April. And we project that throughout August, it would probably decline by about 50%. Collectively, 25% of the total sectors that we monitor, there is an impact of 49% revenue decline in those top 5 sectors. So those are the ones we really worry about. They create, roughly speaking, about 33% of the jobs in Albuquerque. Somewhat stable sectors, and also keep in mind, even this has some decline. But the construction, healthcare, and all this listed on the slide have somewhat lesser decline than the one which are hit the hardest. However, construction have a caveat, it is stable right now, but there is a lot of pressure on the workers' health concerns, supply chain issues, and decreased demand. When people lose job, they probably will hold off their renovation projects, and the commercial projects may also get paused right now. So there are some issues with that. Healthcare, initially we thought would be actually a bright spot. However, there is a lot of deferral on routine procedures and elective procedures. So actually, as we have heard recently, there had been furloughs and layoffs in that sector. So that also is troubling trend. There is an office sector, which is not mentioned here, but it is approximately generating about 16% of the gross receipts tax. It comprises of finance, insurance, legal, technical and professional services, scientific services. We think so far it may be a little stable. However, in long run, it may have some impact on their business. Demand will probably go down, and right now they look stable, but we don't know, and we can't guarantee that it will remain stable. Impact could be deeper, and it will touch those sectors which are primarily able to work from home. Right now it feels like they are able to work, but we don't know how it will remain in future. The budget overview for 2020, and Mayor will talk about it in a short while. We will dissect into the types of tax revenue that we get. Our primary revenue is gross receipt tax. In 2020, our budgeted revenue for gross receipt tax was $426 million. Then we have property tax, we have franchise tax, and we have other revenues, sort of charges for services. This is the biopark, museum, chemo theater, rental, and also some internal service charges within the city. However, the concern here is the gross receipt tax. Our estimated impact on that is about $25.7 million. And this is after counting about $5 million cushion that we had accumulated till February. As you know, the economy was doing better than what we estimated until February. So the revenue were coming slightly higher than what were expected, and we had built sort of a reserve of $5 million there. But even after using that, the net decline is $25 million just in gross receipt tax. Overall decline would be about $27 million for just this fiscal year. Analysis is not complete in all these areas. For example, the other services, we don't know what is the real impact. It's driven by the dates when we are going to open the zoo and things like that. So we will kind of keep a close eye on this. In 2021, the revenue decline would continue. In gross receipt tax, we expected $426 million in 2020. Our revised estimate is $400 million. And in 2021, it will decline further by about $16 million. So that's a 4% decline in 2021. Overall decline in 2021 would be $24 million. However, that is based on the declined revised estimate of 2020. So if you compare what we thought pre-COVID in 2020 and what we estimate now in 2021, the difference is almost $52 million, which is pretty significant and material. We are waiting from the federal government on a clarity and some guideline whether we can use the help from the federal government for revenue decline. It is not usable as of right now. We are lobbying with the federal government that we should be allowed to use that money for revenue decline and reimbursement. So a lot of our future budgetary actions will depend or hinges upon whether the federal government will allow us to use the money for the revenue decline. Let me just talk about the expense of the 2020 budget. Our original budget, expenditure budget, was $660 million. As of now, we have used $447 million of 660. So we have remaining balance to be spent of about $213 million. Out of that, we have identified some savings, and Mayor is going to talk about that in detail, which is about $10 million. So in other words, from our expenditure budget, we can save about $10 million, and that is just as of now. We may have to look into that further and find more savings. So, as I mentioned before, our revenue decline for 2020 is $27 million, and the identified savings is about $10 million as of now. So we have a net shortfall which we need to worry about, which is approximately $17.5 million. Now, whether the actions we will have to take depends upon whether the government, the federal government, will allow us to use that money for the revenue decline. If not, the other options are kind of gloomy. Many cities have furloughs right now. They are not waiting for next year, such as El Paso, San Antonio, Cincinnati, Detroit. They already have furloughs in place. Another sort of demand on the budget right now, which is unexpected, is the hazard pay. And it's a well-deserved demand from our first responders. However, is it do we pay that, or do we do the layoffs or furloughs? So our primary goal right now is not to have layoffs and prevent furloughs. In the context of $17.5 million revenue and deficit, the net revenue deficit, there is a reserve of $54 million. We have been very prudent as far as our financial management. There is a requirement of 1/12 reserve, which we have been maintaining. And even when the revenues increased, we had increased the corresponding reserve. So through that prudent management practice, I think we have the required reserve in place, which can be used. In 2021 budget, things that we will have to consider is reduction of services, operations, and contracts. We will have to dissect into each of these items and go into deeper and figure out where we can save. So some of the low-hanging fruits, such as suspension of travel for an entire year, that would save us some money. And then if we don't get the money from the federal government to fill the hole of the revenue decline, we will have to think about the furloughs. The duration of that would be depending upon how much we can save in the expenditure, what the revenue actually looks like. The better revenue picture will emerge in the middle of May, when we will get the gross receipts tax for the month of March. Right now, all this is estimate. It can change. We don't know what are the real numbers. The revenue impact could be much sharper than we think. But by 15th of May, we will get the gross receipts tax for March, and that would be the real number. The number will get even better in June when we see the actual gross receipts tax for month of April. So we will be keeping an eye on that. With that, I think we're going to talk about what exactly we are doing for current fiscal year. And we are lucky to have a mayor who actually went to Harvard Business School. So I think this would be very handy in coming up with a plan as to what we are going to do. So with that, Mayor, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. As our city goes through this, we're looking at a couple of different items, and I'll touch on them here. First, I want to mention that cities from El Paso to San Antonio to Detroit to Cincinnati, they are all doing different kinds of either furloughs or cuts and this kind of stuff. So as I talk with my mayoral colleagues from around the country and even in New Mexico, again, these are very tough times for our government. These are obviously individuals, just like the individuals in the private sector who've lost their job. That is happening in the public sector as well around the country. And as Sanjay mentioned, we're doing the best we can to try and prevent that. And so right now we're taking the following steps. We are identifying through our city's departments just $4 million in savings right across the top. And this is around things like supplies and repairs and maintenance and things like this. Also a couple of million in contractual savings. And this is as of now. as Sanjay mentioned, we've directed our departments to work on this for the next fiscal year as well. We're also, again, the key to all of the stability in Albuquerque is really based on this federal funding. In the CARES Act, we fought through the Conference of Mayors, which I was involved with nationally, and also talking to our federal delegation. We're very grateful. There's a piece in there for large cities that have all the hospitals and the airports and so forth. And if that comes through, true to what it's supposed to do, it is going to desperately help our city and prevent these furloughs and layoffs. It remains to be seen. We're waiting for the check, and we're also waiting for the rules on how to use it. So hopefully in the next 2 weeks we'll get clarity on that, and then we'll be able to know exactly where we're at. But if that works, we're very grateful for that, and it will save probably thousands of jobs, or at least thousands of furloughs at the city of Albuquerque if that happens. So that's in the works. We should know hopefully in the next 2 weeks, again, the full amount, when we get it, and how we can use it. Also relatedly in there was some funding for our transit department, or not necessarily for the department, but for transit infrastructure and also for aviation infrastructure. So we're working with those two departments to understand, again, a lot of this money has strings attached to it. And if, for example, there's money to build something, but not money to be able to do payroll for the money that we're not getting through tax revenue, we're still in the same box with respect to potential furloughs. So the flexibility of this money is extremely important, and that right now is an unknown that we're continuing to work with DC on figuring out. And then, of course, the last piece too, our city, which is a state rule, but we've always done it, has to have 1/12 reserves. And this is, again, a state policy. And now is exactly why we have those reserves. So if the federal funding doesn't come through, we're going to have to use those reserves. Otherwise, we'll have to do furloughs and layoffs. So that reserve process, perhaps too, depending again on how much money the state gets, if they want to help out municipalities or at least Albuquerque, we really think just saying, okay, you can just use those reserves is a very simple and clean way to do it so that we can use that money in the way that's most helpful to the city of Albuquerque. So there's that also as a kind of backstop and fallback position. But of course, those decisions will be left to, of course, our city council, as well as the state legislature and the Department of Finance at the state level. So I think with that, I do want to mention just one thing about the economic side of this and reopening. The mathematical statistical models all seem to indicate that around April 29th is still the peak, at least in New Mexico, of cases and strain on our healthcare system. Now, that's just the peak. That doesn't mean that's when it goes away. And this is a curve, so that's the top of the curve, and then hopefully it'll go down. There's a couple of things that we're thinking through. We're thinking through relapse, what happens. We know that there's going to be other curves down the road that could last for a year. So we're going to have to think about these different public health orders in that context. But I also know that it's time to start doing that. So we are in conversations. I've convened the chambers here in town, and we're going to be discussing a path to recovery. And we're also trying to understand how can we balance, right, saving people's lives and also trying to save people's livelihood. And that's not a false, that is a false choice. We can do both at the same time. But it is going to take some patience because April 29th is still, the way this is going now, a long ways off. And so until we see what happens around then, we're not going to have a real clear timeline. But hopefully after that we will. All right, with that, takeout, speaking of local business, yesterday was Dion's. All right, so with that, questions?
I don't know if it's for you or the CFO, but if the CARES Act money cannot be spent on supplanting the operating, is it likely we are going to have furloughs or layoffs, whatever the case may be? And the second part of the question is, if you do touch the $50 million in city reserves, can you talk about how that might affect the city's bond rating long term?
Two questions. One was about, actually I remember the second one, so let's break them up. So first I'll bring up Sanjay to answer them. The second one about the bond rating, Sanjay can speak to that. And the first one was
if we can't use the CARES money, are we going to have furloughs?
Oh, yeah. So the question is, if we can't use the CARES money, are we going to have furloughs? That is dependent on your second question on whether or not we can use our reserves. If we can effectively use our reserves, the answer is no, we'll be able to avoid that. And so, again, we have kind of two backstops before we have to talk about furloughs and reserves. One is the federal money, and then the two is our state reserves. And for more on that, Sanjay Bhakta.
So if we use the reserve for plugging the deficit, that could be an issue with the bond rating. The reserve is considered sufficient before COVID-19 hit us. 1/12 is pretty reasonable and sufficient, but no one envisioned that the steep decline we would have in the first and second quarter, which can, in light of that decline, the reserve may not be sufficient. So there are two issues with the reserve. If we use $17.5 million reserve by end of 2020, we have an issue of the beginning reserve for 21. And that certainly will get attention of the bond rating agencies. As a matter of fact, we had discussion with Moody's just day before yesterday. And we will get a downgrade on the bond rating based on how much reserve we have. And it is not something unique to us. I think most of the local governments throughout the country do not have sufficient reserve. They always thought this is sufficient, but who knew that there could be a 27% GDP decline in just one quarter? That's unheard of. So to answer your question on the bond rating, if we have to dip into the reserve, it may have impact on the bond rating. That's why Mayor has mentioned we are lobbying to use the CARES Act money for the revenue decline. What was the other question?
You answered, yeah, you got
That's
that.
okay. Thank you.
You answered everything.
Other ones? We prioritize those in person, so.
And I guess this is my last question on the financial end. You know, nationally, New Mexico ranks 7th in the nation in its reliability for all governments in gross receipts tax or sales taxes. So our structure is very different. Does that make this time a lot more challenging for a city like Albuquerque or for a state like New Mexico, given how our financial structure is?
You know, I think like a lot of us, whether it's our own family situation or our own work situation, there's sort of silver linings in this world, and there's also, real challenges. And so with respect to the city, the downside is that we are heavily dependent on GRT. I think the upside is, we've always criticized our reliance on the public sector for jobs. Ironically, these are the jobs that are essential, and that includes the labs, it includes all the government jobs. So in some ways, there is a tried and true thesis that I remember even when I was a kid hearing about, even in the late 80s, about Albuquerque, which is that, our peaks are not as high as everyone else's because of this issue, but our valleys economically are not as low as everyone else's. And we also tend to lag, right? We recover later, but we also feel the effects later. And I actually think that's going to be no different in this situation. So again, there's something to be grateful for, and also something that's still problematic in our economy.
We have one from Jessica Dyer at the Albuquerque Journal. How much does the city have tied up in contracts, and what is the process for deciding which to cut?
Question is about how much we have tied up in contracts and how are we deciding what to cut. There's a couple of pieces to this, and I'll start. Sanjay, if you want to jump in. I know it's tens of millions in contracts. It's not hundreds of millions. And so that range also goes across everything, whether it is event contracts for Summerfest or whether it's contracts for needed workers at APD that are on contract through like employment firms and so forth. So there's a wide range, and it's very difficult to sort of categorize them. That's also why our criteria to deal with them is really going to be contract specific. The last thing I would mention on that is that Albuquerque is a little bit different than the rest of the state in that, because of just the population and the fact that we have a bunch of the major hospitals, the airport, the shopping mall, all of these things, we bear costs from around central New Mexico. And some of those are embedded in our contracts. And so it's actually a much tougher problem to unravel those. And it's one argument why we're trying to say that some of these contracts are, to cancel them or keep them would be related to reimbursement for Corona. Because really it's a central New Mexico regional, especially from healthcare, issue that even some of this touches. So Sanjay, anything you want to add? It's up to you.
I think the unspent balance in the contract is $54 million right now.
There you go. I was right. Between 10 and 100.
We have a question in from Chris McKee. If the federal funds come into play as you're hoping they will, is there any idea of how long it will fund government operations for?
So based on our projections, and I'll start with this, the question is about if the federal funds come through, how long this will help us. Again, the key is what all is allowable and what's not. But we do know that roughly if we've got 70 million next year, 50 million this year, that's 120 million. Roughly the federal funding is 150 million. So that math works today. The challenge is if this goes a month longer, right, then we're short again. So today we're in a very good position with respect to this. But if we're having the same conversation in May about June, we're not going to have enough.
And
Come on up here if you.
So, the current guideline we have on that is that this money should be spent by December 31st. However, we don't know how long this virus impact will linger, not just economically, but also on the people. And that date right now seems to be too early to us. And we will be talking to our congressional delegation and lobbying for extending that time frame that you have to use the money from March 1st through December 31st. But that's the guideline at present, which may change. Thank you.
We have another one from Chris Ramirez of KOB. Does the mayor have direction from Trump admin or Congress what federal reimbursement levels look like for the city of Albuquerque, the dollar amount?
He was 150, right?
Yeah, the 150 is actually
Well,
something.
come on up.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the reimbursement levels that we're talking about?
Yes. So they haven't actually listed the dollar amount by the municipalities on any website, or the government hasn't said that. What we know so far is that the state will get $1.25 billion. That's already communicated. And it's also communicated that we will qualify for direct payment. So using the formula that all other cities are using, our estimate is that it would be $150 million. And I have checked with a lot of informal folks that I talked to, like CFO Forum, Municipal League, and it seems to be the right amount. So we are expecting 150 million allocation out of $1.25 billion. Thank you.
Any others?
One last question on the financial end. Oh, I'm sorry, is there any more?
No,
Okay. If we can't use reserves, if we don't get the 150 million in CARES money, could city services be affected to the average taxpayer? Would we notice it?
The question is about, if we don't get the federal funding and if the state reserves plan doesn't work out, will we actually see an impact in services? And the answer is it certainly depends on the gap, right? So if the gap is big, then yes. If the gap is small, then no. But what you would see it in is a lot of things. You might see it in operating hours at whether it's libraries or zoos, because that's something, if they're hourly employees, that it's something we can shrink to help compensate. You might see it in fewer bus routes. We're always going to prioritize public safety. So I think as of today, we don't anticipate any changes in that world. You'd see it in a whole lot less Summerfest events, or maybe no Summerfest at all. All of that kind of stuff are the things that we'd have to cut out.
So we have another question from Chris McKee at KRQE. The situation is unprecedented. What's your message to city workers who feel nervous about possibly losing pay or their jobs?
The question is about, what's our message to city workers with respect to this? And my message is, number one, that we have a good team in place to deal with this, that I'm very confident in. And if we hopefully can get either federal or state help or both, we're going to be just fine. And that's a very good thing. We have essentially 2 firewalls before the city of Albuquerque employees are deeply affected. And it's a credit to both the congressional leadership that we have, the folks at the state level, and then our finance team at DFA. And so I feel that we're in one of the better positions of other cities. So not that it helps a lot, but we're in a much better place than a lot of other cities that I talk to, who again are already furloughing and so forth. And that being said, it's in part thanks to the sacrifice and actually really the patience and accommodation that our city employees have shown. So I do want to thank them, especially the folks in the collective bargaining units. We all know about that we're all under different MOUs for how to work this out, but everyone has been a team player. We've been acting as one Albuquerque, and the fact that we've been able to put together these different programs with respect to HR and work from home and the different hours and sick leave and so forth, that has enabled us to keep going and keep a path forward that doesn't include furloughs and layoffs. So I want to thank everyone literally for pitching in to make that possible.
One more from Jessica Dyer at the Journal. What signs do you have that this money will be usable for lost revenue?
So the question is, what signs do we have that this money will be usable for lost revenue? Interestingly, I think it's very debatable at this point. And so Sanjay can jump in about what maybe the CFO forums and things are saying. We also know if we need to, we would absolutely go to court over this. It doesn't mean if we would win or lose. We also are hopeful that in the next round of funding that I know is being discussed in DC right now, the Conference of Mayors and the Municipal League has been adamant that the top priority for governments should be just replacing lost revenue to prevent layoffs. That is much, much more important financially than giving us some money to actually buy 10 more buses. And so this is the fight right now. And so it's being fought at basically every level. And I'm assuming when there's a special session, even in our state, this is going to be a major piece of contention. Sanjay, do you want to add anything else to that? Okay. Yeah. And anyway, anything else?
So I have a question. So if you guys do reopen and then have to close again, but you already used some of that money, how are your kind of plans after that?
Mm-hmm. The question is about if we reopen, what do we do with the money? And if we have to close again, how does that work? And I think what we're looking at is, we want to be able to open and stay open. And so how we open is really important to that question. And especially for Albuquerque, it's probably inevitable that it's going to be different here than other places in New Mexico. Again, because we have the airport and we have the hospitals and we have the population and the density. So I think the rules of how we reopen, again, are going to be very different here. They may last longer, they may not. I just know they're probably going to be different because we are very unique with respect to the rest of the state. So to do this, we're trying to understand that if we, for example, have phase 1 reopening, and then we're expecting relapses or flare-ups that might be geographic. For example, if it's in a particular nursing home, like we've already seen, or if it's in a particular area of town, we might have to have different rules with respect to quarantining and distancing in those areas. So the key for us is, as long as we are doing our job to stay at home now, and our healthcare system catches up with respect to beds and ventilators, we're going to be able to weather that, and we won't have to worry about the financial side of this as much. But this is the danger. If we make changes before April 29th and we know what's going on after that, we really could put at risk the situation where we open up and then all of a sudden there's another spike and the hospitals aren't ready and we have to totally shut down again. We really want to avoid that. The best way we can avoid that is continuing to stay at home.
So unrelated question from Chris McKee at KRQE. Do you have any updates from the county about MDC inmate acceptance after yesterday's announcement that you made?
Questions about do we have any updates from MDC? We did get a letter back that was a real misnomer, I thought. It basically said we just have to take everyone to UNMH. And one, I don't think that makes sense under the law, so we're going to be raising that concern. Two, that's extremely dangerous. Taking felons and violent criminals directly to the hospital instead of the jail is a dangerous idea for New Mexico. So we are going to push back first just by letting them know and trying to see if we can work that out. And if not, we will use our legal team. We will ask for help from others around the state like the AG. And we cannot have a jail in Bernalillo County that does not accept our criminals. So that's just the way the system works. We all got to do our part and they got to do theirs.
Can we get a copy of that letter that you got? Just-
Yeah, I'm sure that shouldn't be a problem.
I've got a couple off-topic questions that have been sent to me, unless other people.
Yeah, we're gonna have to wrap up here pretty quick, but.
Okay.
Fire away.
I got two that have been sent to me. One is, there have been a lot of citations that have been issued for people being inside parks after hours here recently, particularly at night, 10 in one day, for example. Is that a concerted effort right now to crack down on social distancing by having APD issue these citations?
The question is about citations at parks, and that's a pretty specific one, so I would actually suggest asking APD about that. I would just say in general, we're only citing people in that situation if they're probably gathering socially. I don't, again, know the specific situations, but if it's the kind of late night party at the park, that's what we're going to cite people for. And so, again, not knowing the specifics, I don't know if that was the case. But right now, that's the only situation that we're really focused on is, these gatherings that basically we would cite people for anyway.
Okay. And it was a basketball game with some teenagers. And then a viewer question that was sent in to us, we've had actually 3 of these that people have gotten citations for weeds. So a viewer wanted us to ask, isn't an appropriate time to be citing people for weeds given the circumstances right now?
The questions about weeds and citations, that's a pretty routine process. And this is a good example of the continuity of government. If your neighbor, those aren't generated by the city, they're generated by your neighbors. And so if those calls come into 311 and they have a sort of scoring system, and if it gets bad enough, they send you a notice, that is just our city running as it normally does. And those are pretty lightweight citations and so forth. So I think that's just an example of us trying to keep the city running. All right. Thanks so much. We'll see you Monday. Were they resisting?
No, it just says in the citation there was a group of kids who were like between 18 and 20 years old.